So let's talk about from the time that you were at Wiley Music Store that became Jacobson and to Eckroth up to the second version of the Eckroth store. How had gear changed just in that time period only, not talking about mid 90s onward where everything exploded with digital and stuff, but just that beginning? Was it still pretty much all the same? These.
It was. I mean, they were basically the same. They're one of the biggest things that came out was the Floyd Rose
Mm-hmm.
vibrato system, which um, works wonderfully. They still work wonderfully. They do what they do, but I hated working on them
Mm-hmm.
because they're so temperamental. They're very temperamental, um, but that changed, and gear. Um, like I say, I was into vintage stuff, and at that time, when I worked at Wiley's, um, old Fender amps would come through. I mean, you could pick them up for practically nothing, like an old deluxe reverb, blackface deluxe reverb from like mid '60s. Pick them up for 150 bucks,
Mm-hmm.
that type of thing. And I remember having bassman heads and bandmaster heads stacked up on top of each other for a couple $100 a piece, maybe, if
Yeah.
that much, that type of thing. And um, and that stuff was just starting to get popular. But I mean, the Marshalls, um, they were still Marshall. And in the early '80s, they started changing things. They went into the JCM 800s, and soon to the 900s. And they were actually, you could get more gain out of them at a lower volume. They sounded good. Um, Fender started coming out with more versatile amps at that
Mm-hmm.
time too. Uh, PV was going strong in the early '90s. They came out with their classic series, the Delta Blues. That's
Mm-hmm.
still one of the best factory-made tube amps, in my opinion,
Sure.
that was ever made.
Yeah.
And anyway, so they were, but the tube thing hadn't gone away. It was still strong. It always kind of remained strong. I think it was like in the '70s where Solid State tried to take over, but
Yeah.
just never did. Um, and um, so so the tube amps kind of remained the same. Guitars, um, Martin was Martin. They were still coming out with good products, that type of
Mm-hmm.
thing, and not changing a whole lot of things. In the early '80s, they finally broke down and started putting adjustable truss rods in their guitars. In
Mm-hmm.
their big change. Taylor guitars came out, and they still do put Martin, uh, probably Martin's biggest competitor. But there was a lot of boutique companies coming out at that time. Back in the late '80s, um, boutique amp makers, tube amp makers, were starting to spring up,
Yeah.
and that's where that market started,
Mm-hmm.
um, with Kendrick amps and Matchless
I was just gonna say
and
matches.
Dr. Z, and
Mm-hmm.
those guys. Um, and then then there was, let's see, what was the company? It was Line Six. I think it was Line Six. At that time, one of the first companies to start modeling amps, coming out with amp modeling,
Yeah.
that type of thing. And I think there was another company, I can't remember the name of that came out with amp modeling, one of the first companies. But
Yeah. I think it maybe Digitech might have been up in that area because I know I was using like an RP1 from like 1990, but
yeah,
what you're talking about is still earlier than that. So.
yeah, there were um, yeah, '80s. I can't remember the name of the company. Anyway, it was I think one of the very first. I think it was even before Line Six. We came out with some modeling app. But yeah, and then the '90s came, and started. having all the '90s guitars, the big hair guitars, you know, and they had the Floyd Roses on them, and the V's and Explorers and stuff like that, which were basically old designs.
Yeah,
So,
yeah, exactly. Because they had come out decades earlier, but they were way before their time. You know?
Yes, definitely.
Explorers and the V's, yeah, just amazing stuff. Wow, okay. And so then, as you know, you continued on with the Divide Avenue Eckroth building. Then, what was the decision to go and move from that location, which was built just for that store, to go across the highway to the other location?
You know, we just kind of outgrew that place. We just needed more space, and and now there's, you know, the new building has other businesses in it, and but
So
it
Eckroth owns the entire building,
right,
and then they sublet out the other portions that they don't need yet. Okay.
and and then the printed music division was bought out by J.W. Pepper, and they were moved down the hall in a totally separate space down there, and they're no longer down there, but they're doing things online, but that was divided up, that type of thing. So we had more of our own space, and that we could do, you know, design more around the instruments, and more room there too.
And when the current Eckroth was being created and built, did you have any influence or decision making on, like, hey, we are going to do a whole new guitar area in this building, let me go and say this is what I would like to see?
Not really.
Okay.
The person that designed that building, the architect, is actually Glenn Ingalls, which is a very fine musician himself, and a designer and a store designer, and he went in and designed the store, so it's pretty much left up to him. And so he designed everything, and he knows what goes into making display areas for music, for music instruments, and, you know, display and stuff like that. So that was his main bag.
Nice.
Yeah.
I've been in there handful of times, not nearly as often as the second store, but that third store is very nice.
Oh yeah, because I mean, I would the only thing that I would change on that store was there's the two big guitar walls, and I would turn them sideways so you could see the guitars from that angle. You can see them on all four sides.
Yeah.
Instead of just seeing the one side and then having to go around the back. But
sure.
But anyway, but other than that, that was it was a well-designed building.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, going from the late 80s, early 90s, when we were talking about the Floyd Rose being like the big innovation in guitars, and then the modeling amps, what do you think about, you know, from like the mid 90s onward? How did you see guitars and basses and amplifiers change? And do you feel like it's for the good, or do you feel like it's not nearly as good as some of the things that were done in the vintage era?
I mean, you know, there was big changes that I saw was many things like Fender and were introduced guitars, and Fender had the Squier series for, you know, since the 80s.
Yeah.
But now they're so huge, they have so many models, and to me it's too many.
Yeah.
But the variety that has come out in the 90s and the 2000s is incredible because they're being imported, and CNC machines help carve all these things out, so you can make a decent guitar for not a ton of money.
Right.
without a lot of hand labor in there, and that's so the variety is mind-boggling.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I can, if I want a Bob Tepikke guitar made, all I'd have to do is get in touch with somebody, or a company that makes guitars overseas, and they say, well, you can have your name put on these guitars, design them, but you got to buy like 1,000 guitars or whatever,
Right.
and you can have them designed, that type of thing. But there's like only a few handfuls of guitar manufacturers overseas. They're just making guitars for everybody.
Yeah.
A lot of the imports.
Right. Yeah, I think it's Court. I think
Court is one of the big guys.
One of the major players. That
Yeah, Samick.
Yeah.
Samick is another big one. But and you can make them to different degrees of quality. I mean, some of the Japanese guitars coming out these days are incredibly nice guitars. I mean, but yeah, and then I saw, where Fender came out, their custom shop stuff, and Gibson came out with their custom shop, because a lot of the stuff, like in the 90s or the 80s, that's the big hairband thing. The 80s, guitars after that kind of went back. It kind of seemed like to older designs and more retro and vintage types. A lot of that stuff came out again, and so these custom shops opened up and are making handmade instruments, and there's a ton of makers out there now that are independent makers of guitars, boutique guitars.
Yeah.
And a lot of those are reminiscent of the old designs. And so a lot of that went back, and a lot of the Floyd Rose stuff dropped off. Not that it isn't still popular, but it's not like it was.
Right.
And so there's still a lot of the hairband guitars made and stuff like that, and the designs like that, but a lot of the vintage stuff, retro designs, crept back in. People are figuring out where the good designs were.
Yeah, and it's amazing that they were able to go and figure that out so early.
Oh yeah.
That this is good balance. This feels good when you play, and they've added comfort cuts along the way to go and make it even more ergonomical. But
Oh yeah. Well, Leo Fender didn't even play guitar.
Yeah.
He wasn't a guitar player, but he asked questions. He had music, performer and guitar player friends and stuff like that, like Bill Carson and stuff like that. And and got their opinions and made these guitars. And like the first Fender guitar that came out, the Broadcaster, still, I mean, a couple of years ago, they came out with a reissue of those again. I mean, there's always been the Telecaster, but Fender could not use the name Broadcaster anymore because Gretsch owned it. But now Fender owns Gretsch, and now they can pretty much do what they want.
Yeah, no, absolutely.